All right, forget everything you think you know about Wall Street. Forget the algorithms, the fancy computers, all of it. We are stepping back in time to the Gilded Age, a world with basically no rules, no safety nets, just giants. And our guide through this whole thing is a man named Henry Clues. He spent 50 years right in the thick of it, and his memoir is like a front row seat to the beautiful chaos. So let's dive in.
Now, you might hear that and think he's talking about a market crash, but he wasn't. He was talking about the start of the Civil War. And that's the whole point, you see. In his world, finance and actual war were almost the same thing. This wasn't some quiet, orderly place of business. It was an arena. Raw emotion, constant fighting, and just pure, unfiltered chaos.
And there was this huge shift that made it all happen. Before the big financial panic in 1857, Wall Street was run by what Clues called old fogeyism. Think slow, cautious, run by old guys playing it safe. But that crash, it wiped them out. And in their place, a new element rose up. These were young, hungry, ambitious speculators who looked at the market and didn't see a place to be careful. No, they saw a battlefield where only the fittest would survive.
So, on this new battlefield, you needed a new kind of weapon. And the ultimate weapon of the era was something called the market corner. And nobody was better at it than the first true titan of Wall Street, Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man everyone just called the Commodore.
So what exactly is a corner? Well, it's the ultimate power move. Okay, picture this. You secretly buy up almost every single available share of a company. Now, anyone who bet against that stock, the short sellers who need the price to go down, they eventually have to buy the shares back to finish their trade. The problem for them? You own all the shares. You control the entire supply, so you get to name the price. It is quite literally financial checkmate.
And Vanderbilt had this down to a science. His method was simple and just ruthless. Take his legendary corner of the Harlem Railroad stock. First, he just quietly started buying it all up. Then he sat back and watched as a bunch of corrupt politicians started shorting it, thinking they could crash the price and make a killing. They had absolutely no idea they were walking right into his trap. He had created total scarcity. The trap was set. All that was left to do was squeeze him and name his price.
And what a price it was. The stock had been trading for just a few dollars a share. It skyrocketed to $285. Just think about that jump. Vanderbilt had the entire New York State legislature caught in his trap, forcing them to buy back the stock at this insane, ruinous price. It was a display of power by one man that Wall Street had simply never seen before.
So when his opponents were completely broken and begged him for some kind of compromise, Vanderbilt's response became legendary. You see, for him, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the total, crushing victory. This quote, it just perfectly captures the nerve, the sheer dominance of these guys.
But it wasn't always about brute force like Vanderbilt. The titans of this age had another weapon in their arsenal: pure, unadulterated cunning. And that brings us to a couple of other characters, the wily Daniel Drew and the absolute master of conspiracy, Jay Gould.
You've probably heard the term watering stock, right? Well, you can thank Daniel Drew for that. Before he was a Wall Street guy, he was a cattle drover, and he had this trick. He'd feed his cows a bunch of salt so they'd get really thirsty and drink tons and tons of water right before they were weighed for sale. He brought that exact same deceptive, crafty idea to the stock market, basically inventing the art of making a company look way more valuable than it actually was.
So Drew was kind of crafty in a homespun way, but Jay Gould, he was on a whole other level. This was a quiet, very secretive man whose schemes were so ridiculously ambitious they could threaten the entire economy of the United States. He wasn't just playing the stock market, he was playing the entire nation.
His masterpiece of manipulation was the Black Friday gold panic of 1869. And look at how fast this all went down. Early September, he gets his plan in motion. By the middle of the month, gold has shot up from 130 to a staggering 162. But then, on September 24th, bam, the government figures out what's going on, steps in, and breaks his corner. The result? Instantaneous financial carnage.
So you have to ask yourself, how did one guy get so close to cornering all the gold in the entire country? Well, Gould's plan wasn't just about buying up gold. Oh no, it was a deep conspiracy. He actually tried to get the president, Ulysses S. Grant, on his side. He was whining and dining him, trying to isolate him from his advisors, all to keep the government from stepping in and ruining his brilliant scheme.
Gould's plan created a massive panic, But honestly, panics were just a fact of life back then. For every single speculator, a market crash was the ultimate test. It was that moment where you could lose every penny you had, or, if you were brave and a little bit crazy, you could make an absolute fortune picking through the rubble.
Henry Clews tells this incredible story about one of his clients during a crash. The man came to him completely and utterly broken. He'd lost almost everything. And in this final act of just pure despair, he handed Clews his last few $100s and basically said, "Here, do what you want. I assume this will be gone too."
But Clews, he saw opportunity in all the chaos. He took that tiny sum and invested it. And when the client came back a few months later, his entire fortune had been reversed. He was comfortably fixed again. It's a perfect story to show how, in that world, total ruin and unbelievable opportunity were just two sides of the very same coin.
Of course, not everyone had that kind of nerve. Clews also tells this other kind of funny story about a guy who just kept getting bounced around by conflicting advice. One person would tell him to buy, so he'd buy. Then someone else would tell him to sell, so he'd sell immediately, usually at a loss. After getting whipsawed back and forth, he finally had this moment of clarity about what he'd been, and it was a very expensive lesson.
So after all these wild stories of corners and conspiracies and panics, what can we actually take away from it all? It turns out these old-school titans have a whole lot to teach us about how markets really work, even today.
When you really boil it down, the lessons are pretty clear. This was a time when a single person, through sheer force of will, could bend the entire market to their liking. The market wasn't driven by data. It was driven by the rawest human emotions, greed and fear. Things like corners and conspiracies weren't weird exceptions. They were just part of the game. And yeah, the tools have changed. Today we have complex algorithms instead of backroom deals, but the fundamental game, the psychology of it was all forged right here.
And that really brings us to the final question. We live in this world of high-speed trading, complex regulations, all this stuff designed to prevent the kind of chaos that Vanderbilt and Gould created. But has the fundamental game really changed? Or is it still just the same old contest of greed versus fear, just being played out now at the speed of light? That's something to think about.